Take one more step, ma'am, and we'll remove you by force. The words cracked across the grand auction hall with the sharpness of breaking glass, freezing every whispered conversation beneath the glittering chandeliers. Hundreds of eyes turned at once toward the entrance of the prestigious Ashcroft International Luxury Auction in Manhattan, where collectors, celebrities, financiers, and museum representatives had gathered for what was expected to become the most expensive private collection sale of the year. At the center of the silence stood Naomi Brooks. She didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply looked at the white security director gripping her forearm as though she were an intruder who had wandered into a world far beyond her reach. Richard Collins had spent nearly 15 years protecting exclusive events attended by the wealthiest names in America. He believed he could recognize who belonged within seconds. Designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, luxury watches, famous faces. Naomi matched none of those expectations. She wore a fitted black blouse, dark trousers, comfortable leather flats, and carried nothing except a slim portfolio. To Richard, she looked completely ordinary. Ordinary people, he believed, didn't walk into invitation-only auctions where individual paintings regularly sold for more than private islands. Your invitation isn't valid anymore, Richard announced loudly enough for nearby bidders to hear. You're disrupting the event. Leave now. Conversation stopped. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway toward smiling lips. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while others openly stared with quiet curiosity, already assuming security must have uncovered another scammer attempting to sneak into high society. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes toward the hand wrapped around her arm before lifting them back to Richard's face. There was no fear, no embarrassment, only an unsettling calm that somehow made his confidence grow louder instead of quieter. Please remove your hand, she said softly. Richard laughed once. Not until you're outside. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Brooks. A murmur drifted across the marble floor. Several guests instinctively stepped backward to create space around the confrontation, while others reached for their phones. Luxury auctions rarely produced public drama. Tonight had suddenly become an exception. Standing several feet away, senior event manager Victoria Hale frowned as she approached. What's happening? She asked. Richard never looked away from Naomi. Unauthorized guest. Refusing instructions. Victoria glanced briefly at Naomi's composed expression before looking toward the digital guest registry on her tablet, but Richard spoke again before she could verify anything. She's trying to bluff her way into the VIP preview. Those nearby nodded as if that explanation settled everything. A gray-haired collector wearing an expensive Italian suit smirked. Every year someone thinks confidence can buy access. Light laughter followed. Naomi heard every word. None of it changed her expression. Inside, however, an old memory quietly stirred. Different building, different city, different faces, the same assumptions. Years earlier, she had been asked whether she was delivering catering instead of attending an investment reception she had financed. She remembered the humiliation. She remembered promising herself that success would never erase prejudice, but it would determine how she answered it. That promise echoed silently now as Richard tightened his grip again. Last warning, he declared. Walk out with dignity before we escort you out in front of everyone. The enormous room seemed to inhale all at once, unaware that the woman standing quietly beneath the chandeliers was only seconds away from changing the fate of the entire evening. Naomi Brooks could have ended the confrontation with a single sentence. She could have reached into her portfolio, revealed the platinum credential hidden inside, and watched every expression around her dissolve into instant regret. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, allowing the silence to reveal far more than any explanation ever could. She had learned years ago that prejudice always exposed itself when it believed it would never be challenged. Tonight was never supposed to be about buying art. It was about observing people. 3 months earlier, the board of Aurelius Heritage Capital, the global investment company Naomi had founded from a single office with borrowed furniture, had quietly expanded into the luxury art market. Rather than simply purchasing galleries or auction houses based on financial reports, Naomi insisted on understanding how their clients were actually treated. Financial statements revealed profits. Human behavior revealed character. That was why she arrived alone. No limousine. No executive assistant. No photographers announcing her entrance. She had instructed her entire staff not to accompany her, insisting that no one contact the organizers unless she specifically requested it. Even the invitation carried her legal name instead of the company title recognized across international financial circles. She wanted honesty, not hospitality manufactured for powerful people. Richard Collins interpreted her calm as hesitation. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" he demanded, tightening his voice more than his grip. Naomi met his eyes. "I'm simply waiting." Waiting for what? For everyone to finish making assumptions. The answer irritated him more than defiance would have. Behind him, several guests exchanged amused smiles. A woman wrapped in an elegant emerald evening gown whispered loudly enough for nearby bidders to hear. People like her always think confidence replaces credentials. Her husband chuckled. The security team deserves a bonus tonight. More laughter drifted through the marble hall. Naomi heard every word without acknowledging a single voice. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught her that emotional reactions often became the evidence others hoped to collect. If she raised her voice, she would become the angry woman. If she protested too aggressively, she would become the disruptive guest. If she defended herself too desperately, she would validate every suspicion already forming inside the room. So she chose the one strategy no one expected: absolute composure. Across the hall, a young event coordinator named Emily Carter continued studying the digital registration tablet clutched against her chest. Something refused to make sense. The invitation code Richard claimed was invalid had not disappeared from the guest system. In fact, the profile remained highlighted with a confidential notation she had never seen before. Authorization level, executive acquisition priority. Emily frowned. She refreshed the page. The notation remained. Before she could step closer, Richard noticed her movement. "Emily," he called sharply. "Everything's under control. I just wanted to verify." "There's nothing to verify." His tone ended the conversation before it began. Emily hesitated. She had worked at luxury events for only 8 months. Richard had supervised security longer than she had been in the industry. Challenging him publicly could cost her position. Yet something about the woman standing silently beneath the chandeliers refused to match the story everyone seemed eager to believe. Naomi wasn't pleading. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't searching for an escape. She looked like someone patiently allowing a clock to reach a predetermined hour. The atmosphere inside the auction hall continued changing. More guests abandoned the display cases displaying rare jewelry and museum-quality paintings, gathering instead around the entrance where the confrontation had become the evening's unexpected entertainment. Cell phones quietly appeared beneath dinner jackets. A famous art influencer subtly activated a live recording. Wealthy collectors who moments earlier had debated brushstrokes and historical provenance were now placing informal bets over how quickly security would escort the unknown black woman outside. Richard straightened his jacket and nodded toward 2 additional guards stationed near the grand staircase. They immediately began walking across the polished marble floor. Their synchronized footsteps echoed through the silent hall. Naomi watched them approach without moving an inch. Somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a grandfather clock struck 8 slow chimes. The auction was officially beginning, and with every passing second, the people surrounding Naomi unknowingly moved closer to becoming witnesses to a moment none of them would ever forget. The 2 additional security officers stopped several feet behind Richard Collins, waiting for his signal with the practiced discipline of men accustomed to following orders without asking questions. Their dark suits blended almost seamlessly into the polished elegance of the auction hall, yet their presence changed the atmosphere instantly. This was no longer an uncomfortable misunderstanding. It had become a public removal. Richard folded his hands in front of him and spoke with the confidence of someone certain that the room already belonged to his version of the story. "Escort procedures begin now," he announced. "Ma'am, if you continue refusing to leave voluntarily, we will accompany you outside." Naomi Brooks remained perfectly still. Her eyes slowly wandered across the magnificent ballroom, instead of toward the men preparing to surround her. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across priceless sculptures, antique manuscripts, and centuries-old paintings waiting to be auctioned to the highest bidders. She had spent years studying collections like these, not merely as investments, but as pieces of history. Ironically, she now found herself being treated as though she were the one object that did not belong inside the room. "Are you listening?" Richard asked sharply. "Very carefully," Naomi answered. "Then answer my question." She tilted her head slightly. "You haven't asked one." A ripple of restrained laughter spread through part of the crowd, though it carried more mockery than admiration. Richard's jaw tightened. Before he could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "Security is doing exactly what it should," declared Theodore Langford, one of the auction house's most recognizable patrons. The elderly billionaire collector stepped forward with measured confidence, adjusting the silk pocket square inside his tailored navy jacket. His reputation in the art world carried enormous influence, and people instinctively gave him space as he approached. He studied Naomi for only a few seconds before turning toward Richard. "These events depend on standards," Theodore said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "If someone cannot demonstrate they belong here, removing them protects everyone else." Several collectors nodded immediately. Others murmured words of agreement. The validation from a respected client seemed to erase whatever hesitation remained inside the room. Naomi looked directly at Theodore. "Do standards begin with evidence?" she asked quietly. "Or appearances?" Theodore smiled politely, though the warmth never reached his eyes. "Experience usually tells us enough." Naomi gave a nearly invisible nod, as though quietly recording the answer for herself. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter could no longer ignore what she was seeing. She opened the registration system again, this time accessing the restricted authorization page available only to senior staff. The confidential notation attached to Naomi's profile expanded into additional information. Executive acquisition priority. Direct board authorization. Confidential identity until verification complete. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She checked the name twice. Then a third time. There was no mistake. Whoever Naomi Brooks truly was, she had not entered the building by accident. Emily hurried toward Victoria Hale, lowering her voice. "I think we need to stop this." Victoria accepted the tablet and glanced at the screen. Her expression changed almost immediately. "Where did you find this?" "Restricted authorization." Before either woman could continue, Richard noticed them speaking. "Victoria," he called across the room. "Everything resolved?" Victoria hesitated for only a second before answering. "I'm reviewing something." Richard frowned. He disliked uncertainty, especially in front of influential clients. Turning back toward Naomi, he decided to end the situation before anyone complicated it further. "Enough delays," he declared. "Gentlemen." The two guards stepped forward simultaneously until they stood one on each side of Naomi. Around them, dozens of guests lifted their phones a little higher, eager to capture what they believed would become another viral example of security protecting an exclusive event. No one noticed that several members of the auction administration had quietly disappeared through a side entrance after receiving an urgent internal message. No one noticed the discreet communication devices suddenly lighting up among senior event staff. And certainly no one realized that the calm black woman standing between two security officers had already stopped thinking about whether she would remain inside the auction hall. She was thinking about what would happen to everyone else once the truth finally entered the room. Emily Carter's fingers tightened around the tablet as she read the confidential authorization for a fourth time. The information remained unchanged. Naomi Brooks. Executive acquisition priority. Direct board authorization. Beneath it appeared one final instruction that made her heartbeat quicken. Immediate notification required before any denial of access. Emily slowly lifted her eyes toward the woman standing calmly between two security officers. Naomi showed no sign of panic. She wasn't pleading, arguing, or searching for sympathy. She simply stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had already accepted every possible outcome. Emily had worked enough luxury events to recognize different kinds of guests. Wealthy clients usually demanded attention before anyone noticed them. Executives arrived surrounded by assistants. Celebrities expected cameras. Naomi expected nothing, yet somehow looked more comfortable than many of the guests surrounding her. Victoria, Emily whispered urgently, pulling the senior event manager aside. This is wrong. Victoria accepted the tablet and carefully reviewed the restricted profile. Her expression changed almost immediately. This authorization came directly from the executive committee, she murmured. It bypasses standard registration. Should we stop Richard? Emily asked. Victoria glanced toward the growing crowd where Richard Collins was confidently speaking with Theodore Langford while dozens of guests watched as though the evening's entertainment had already begun. She hesitated. Correcting the head of security in front of influential collectors could create another crisis. I'll confirm this with the board liaison, she said before hurrying through a restricted doorway leading toward the executive offices. Emily watched her disappear, silently hoping she wasn't already too late. Across the ballroom, Richard mistook the silence from management for approval. He folded his arms and looked directly at Naomi. You've delayed this event long enough, he declared. I don't know who convinced you that you belong here, but this ends now. Naomi's expression never changed. Does it? Richard frowned. Excuse me. You seem very certain, Naomi replied calmly. Certainty without verification is an expensive habit. Theodore Langford let out a dismissive laugh. Listen to that, he said to nearby collectors. She talks like she's addressing a board meeting. Another guest smiled. Confidence is free. Membership isn't. Quiet laughter spread through the crowd. Naomi noticed every face, but answered none of them. She had learned long ago that patience revealed far more than arguments ever could. Meanwhile, beyond the ballroom, Victoria reached the executive corridor just as a staff member carrying a headset hurried toward the board offices. Seconds later, 3 members of the executive committee received the same urgent notification on their phones. Executive acquisition, guest detained by security. Immediate response required. The meeting they had been attending ended instantly. Chairs scraped across polished floors as the board members stood and headed toward the ballroom without a moment's delay, unaware that every second of hesitation was allowing the organization's culture to expose itself before the most influential audience it had ever assembled. Richard Collins had reached the end of his patience. What had begun as a routine security intervention had become an uncomfortable spectacle in front of the country's most influential collectors. Every passing minute threatened the polished reputation of the auction house, and in Richard's mind, ending the confrontation quickly mattered more than anything else. He stepped closer until barely a foot separated him from Naomi Brooks. I've given you every opportunity to leave with dignity, he declared, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom. You chose not to cooperate. Naomi met his gaze without hostility. No, she answered calmly. I chose not to surrender my dignity simply because someone demanded it. Her words settled beneath the chandeliers as whispers swept through the crowd. She's really refusing. This is going to end badly. A few guests quietly raised their phones while another murmured. Tomorrow this will be all over social media. Richard noticed the growing audience and felt his frustration rising. If security appeared indecisive before America's wealthiest collectors, confidence in tonight's event could disappear overnight. Theodore Langford folded his arms impatiently. Enough philosophy, he said. Richard has protected these events for years. If he says she doesn't belong here, remove her. Several collectors nodded without hesitation. Richard's reputation carried more weight than evidence no one had bothered to verify. Richard gave a firm nod. Escort her outside. The 2 security officers stepped forward. One reached politely toward Naomi while the other positioned himself beside her, following standard escort procedure. Naomi neither resisted nor stepped back. She simply remained still, her silence somehow stronger than the voices surrounding her. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter tightened her grip on the registration tablet. She glanced anxiously toward the restricted corridor where Victoria had disappeared only moments earlier. She still hadn't returned. Emily looked back at Richard with growing concern. He was no longer acting out of caution. He was trying to protect his own judgment before anyone could question it. Around the room, the whispers continued. It's over. She should have left earlier. Naomi heard every word. For a brief moment, she remembered standing outside a small Chicago gallery years earlier when a man had mistaken her for catering staff before learning she had arrived to discuss an investment. He never apologized. She had smiled, walked inside, and years later quietly purchased the building after the gallery closed. not for revenge, but because she refused to let humiliation shape her future. The memory disappeared as Daniel, the younger security officer, spoke gently. "Ma'am, please come with us." Unlike Richard, there was no contempt in his voice, only discomfort. Naomi gave him a small nod. "Thank you for asking respectfully, Daniel." Daniel hesitated before looking toward Richard. "Sir, maybe we should wait another minute. Management is still." "We're done waiting," Richard snapped, cutting him off. Realizing dozens of eyes were watching, he straightened his shoulders. "If I'm wrong, I'll answer for it. Right now my responsibility is protecting this event." Without another word, he reached forward and gripped Naomi's upper arm. A collective gasp spread through the ballroom. Even several guests who had supported removing her looked uneasy. Emily instinctively stepped forward. "Mr. Collins, wait." Richard ignored her. "Escort her now." Daniel didn't move. Neither did the second officer. They exchanged an uncertain glance, both sensing the situation had crossed a line. Naomi looked down briefly at Richard's hand before meeting his eyes again. "This is the decision you're choosing to make." "Absolutely," Richard replied. Naomi gave the slightest nod. "Then we'll both live with what happens next." At that exact moment, the heavy double doors burst open. Every conversation stopped. Every phone turned toward the entrance as members of the executive board, accompanied by senior legal counsel, hurried into the ballroom with expressions that made one thing instantly clear. They had come to stop a disaster before it became irreversible. The instant the executive board entered the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting lips as every eye followed the group moving quickly across the marble floor. Richard Collins released Naomi's arm, convinced the executives had arrived to support his decision. Straightening his jacket, he stepped forward confidently. "Good evening," he began. "We've had a security issue, but it's under control." No one answered. Board Chairman Charles Whitmore walked past Richard without acknowledging him. His attention remained fixed on Naomi Brooks. He stopped before her and lowered his head respectfully. "Ms. Brooks, I sincerely apologize for the delay." A wave of confusion swept through the crowd. Theodore Langford's confident smile disappeared. Emily Carter slowly exhaled, realizing her instincts had been right all along. Naomi returned a polite nod. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Richard stared in disbelief before stepping forward again. "Mr. Whitmore, this woman entered without proper verification." Charles finally turned toward him. "Without proper verification?" he repeated calmly. "She was verified before this event was announced." Richard frowned. "Sir, there must be some mistake. I was protecting the event." Charles held his gaze. "You were protecting assumptions instead of following procedure." Silence settled over the ballroom. The collectors who had mocked Naomi moments earlier quietly lowered their eyes. Richard searched for another explanation. "She arrived alone. She didn't look like our executive clients." His voice weakened before the sentence ended. Naomi gently raised one hand. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, "please let him finish." The chairman nodded and stepped back. Richard suddenly heard his own words exactly as everyone else was hearing them. Every reason he offered depended on appearance rather than evidence. He had nothing more to say. Naomi looked at him calmly. "Thank you." Charles folded his hands before addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Naomi Brooks is the executive acquisition partner authorized by this board to negotiate tonight's featured collection." Audible gasps echoed beneath the chandeliers. Charles accepted a sealed document Naomi removed from her portfolio and opened it immediately. After reading the first page, he looked back at the audience. "The authorization is fully valid." Naomi stepped forward with quiet composure. "Aurelius Heritage Capital now exercises its exclusive acquisition rights." Complete silence filled the ballroom. Before a single bidding paddle could be raised, ownership of the entire featured collection had already changed hands. Richard stood frozen. Only minutes earlier, he had ordered security to remove the very woman who now owned every masterpiece surrounding him. Yet Naomi showed no triumph. She simply closed her portfolio and remained as calm as she had been from the moment she first entered the room, proving that her worth had never changed. Only everyone else's perception had. Charles Whitmore slowly closed the folder and looked across the silent ballroom, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the grand hall, Ms. Naomi Brooks is not simply an invited guest. He paused. She is the executive acquisition partner approved by this board to negotiate the future ownership of tonight's featured collection. A wave of disbelief swept through the audience. Expressions that had been filled with certainty only moments earlier dissolved into confusion. Theodore Langford's face lost its color. The woman in the emerald gown instinctively lowered the phone she had been using to record. Richard Collins remained frozen where he stood, unable to reconcile the elegant, composed woman before him with every assumption he had confidently made since she entered the building. Charles continued. 3 months ago, the executive committee unanimously authorized Ms. Brooks and Aurelius Heritage Capital to receive exclusive purchasing rights before public bidding should they choose to exercise that option. Quiet gasps echoed beneath the chandeliers. Several collectors exchanged stunned looks. Exclusive purchasing rights meant something almost unimaginable in the luxury art world. It meant that before a single paddle could be raised, before any billionaire could compete for ownership, Naomi possessed the legal authority to acquire the entire featured collection outright. Richard stared at Charles. That's impossible. Charles turned toward him calmly. No, Mr. Collins. It has been documented for weeks. Naomi finally stepped forward, not toward Richard, but toward the center of the ballroom. Every eye followed her. Every camera remained fixed on her. Yet there was no triumph in her expression, only quiet resolve. She looked around the magnificent room, taking in the priceless paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, and rare artifacts gathered from private estates across 3 continents. When I accepted the board's invitation, she began softly, I hope to spend this evening discussing the preservation of history. Her eyes briefly met Richard's before moving across the audience. Instead, I was given an opportunity to witness another kind of history. The kind that repeats itself every time appearance is mistaken for identity. No one interrupted. Many of you looked at me, she continued, and decided who I was before asking a single question. Some of you laughed. Some remained silent. Some encouraged what happened because it seemed easier than asking whether it was right. Theodore slowly lowered his head. Emily stood motionless near the registration desk, feeling both relieved and heartbroken at the same time. Naomi reached into her portfolio once more and removed a slim leather document case. She opened it carefully before handing a signed contract to Charles Whitmore. Mr. Chairman, she said, Aurelius Heritage Capital formally exercises its executive acquisition rights. Charles accepted the document, reading only the first page before looking back up with unmistakable astonishment. Although he had expected Naomi to participate aggressively in the bidding, even he had not anticipated this decision. Ms. Brooks, he said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod. Effective immediately, Aurelius Heritage Capital purchases the entire Ashcroft Legacy Collection under the terms previously negotiated with the Executive Committee. Silence. Complete silence. The number attached to the agreement was never spoken aloud, yet everyone inside the ballroom understood its magnitude. Years of collecting. Hundreds of irreplaceable masterpieces. A transaction valued beyond what most people could imagine had just concluded before the first auction lot had even been introduced. The auction itself was over before it had begun. Richard felt the room spinning around him. Only minutes earlier he had ordered security to remove the woman who now owned every piece displayed beneath the gallery lights. Theodore slowly removed his glasses, unable to hide the disbelief etched across his face. Around the ballroom, guests who had mocked Naomi now avoided even looking in her direction. Yet Naomi displayed no satisfaction at their embarrassment. She simply closed her portfolio and stood with the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she first walked through the doors. The only thing that had changed was that now everyone else finally understood who had been standing before them all along. For several long seconds, no one moved. The magnificent ballroom that had echoed with whispered judgment only moments before now stood in complete silence, as though every chandelier, every painting, and every marble column had become witnesses to a truth no one could escape. Richard Collins remained rooted to the polished floor, his breathing shallow, his confident posture gone. The authority that had filled his voice earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by the unmistakable realization that every decision he had made had been based not on evidence, but on assumption. Charles Whitmore slowly closed the acquisition agreement and turned toward the audience. Tonight's transaction has been completed, he announced. The Ashcroft Legacy Collection is now the property of Aurelius Heritage Capital under the ownership of Ms. Naomi Brooks. A quiet murmur swept through the room, but it carried none of the amusement that had filled the ballroom before. This time it was disbelief mixed with embarrassment. Several collectors who had openly laughed at Naomi quietly slipped their phones back into their pockets, suddenly aware that the recordings they had hoped would capture someone else's humiliation now documented their own behavior. Theodore Langford took one hesitant step forward. His shoulders, once held with effortless confidence, now appeared noticeably heavier. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the evening. Theodore lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "I judged you without knowing you. I contributed to something that should never have happened." Naomi listened without interrupting. When he finished, she answered quietly, "Thank you for acknowledging it. Accountability always begins with honesty." Theodore nodded once, but found no additional words. Nearby, the woman in the emerald gown who had mocked Naomi earlier quietly walked toward the exit, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Others followed her example, not because they wished to leave the event, but because remaining in the ballroom had suddenly become an uncomfortable reminder of their own silence. Charles then faced Richard. The disappointment on his face was unmistakable. "Mr. Collins," he said evenly, "please surrender your security credentials." Richard stared at him as though he had misheard. "Sir." Charles did not raise his voice. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your responsibilities pending a full investigation into your conduct and your failure to follow executive verification protocol." Every member of the security team understood what those words meant. Richard slowly removed the electronic access badge clipped inside his jacket. His hands trembled as he placed it into Charles's waiting hand. No one applauded. No one celebrated. The moment felt too serious for satisfaction. Daniel, the security officer who had politely addressed Naomi earlier, quietly stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks," he said sincerely, "I'm sorry for my part in this." Naomi offered him a gentle smile. "You treated me with respect, even while following orders. Never lose that." Daniel lowered his head with visible relief. Emily Carter stood nearby, still holding the registration tablet that had revealed the truth before anyone else believed it. Naomi turned toward her. "Thank you for asking questions when others were comfortable making conclusions." Emily blinked in surprise. "I wasn't brave enough," she admitted softly. "You were brave enough to notice," Naomi replied. "That's where change begins." The words settled deeply over everyone within earshot. Charles then addressed the room one final time. "Tonight exposed failures that cannot be ignored. Effective immediately, the executive committee will conduct a complete review of our guest verification procedures, employee training, and executive oversight to ensure that no individual is ever judged by appearance before fact again." Several guests nodded quietly. For the first time all evening, applause slowly began to spread across the ballroom. It was not the enthusiastic celebration usually reserved for record-breaking sales. It was quieter, more thoughtful, born from respect rather than excitement. Naomi did not acknowledge the applause. She simply looked once around the room that had first rejected her and then recognized her value. The artwork displayed beneath the lights had changed ownership, but something far more important had shifted that evening. The people inside that ballroom had been forced to confront the cost of prejudice before witnessing the power of dignity, and that lesson would remain long after the final masterpiece left the gallery walls. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind a silence unlike the one that had greeted Naomi Brooks when she first entered the ballroom. That silence had been filled with suspicion. This one carried reflection. Guests slowly returned their attention to the masterpieces displayed throughout the gallery, yet very few were actually looking at the paintings anymore. Their thoughts remained fixed on the woman who had quietly transformed the evening without raising her voice or demanding recognition. Naomi gathered her portfolio and prepared to leave the center of the room. Charles Whitmore approached once more. "Ms. Brooks," he said respectfully, "on behalf of every member of our executive committee, I offer our deepest apology. We failed you before we ever had the opportunity to welcome you." Naomi offered a gentle smile. "You didn't fail me, Mr. Whitmore." He looked surprised. She continued, You revealed something your organization needed to see. The question isn't whether mistakes happen. The question is what we choose to become after they do. Charles nodded thoughtfully. We'll remember that. As members of the board quietly discussed the immediate policy changes that would follow the incident, Naomi walked toward the stage where the newly acquired collection remained illuminated beneath the gallery lights. She paused before an oil painting depicting a young woman standing alone against a storm-filled sky. The artist had painted quiet determination rather than fear. Naomi admired it for a long moment before speaking softly, almost as if she were talking to the artwork itself. People often mistake calm for weakness. Emily Carter happened to overhear the words as she approached. Until they discover where real strength comes from, Emily added carefully. Naomi smiled. Exactly. Emily hesitated before asking one final question. After everything that happened tonight, why did you still complete the purchase? Naomi looked around the ballroom one last time. Because the art was never responsible for the prejudice. She let the sentence settle before continuing. These artists spent lifetimes creating beauty that would outlive them. I won't allow someone else's assumptions to diminish their legacy. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. The answer was so much larger than the conflict everyone had witnessed. It wasn't about proving wealth. It wasn't about humiliating the people who had humiliated her. It was about refusing to let injustice decide the ending of the story. Before leaving, Naomi turned back toward the audience. Many guests instinctively fell silent again. She spoke without anger, without accusation, and without bitterness. Tonight, many people believe they recognized my worth the moment they learned my title. But my value did not change when my identity became known. It was exactly the same when I first walked through those doors. The only thing that changed was your perception. No one looked away. Never measure another human being by appearance, clothing, skin color, or the assumptions that make you comfortable. Measure people by their character, their actions, and the dignity with which they treat others. Because every person you overlook may be carrying a story you have not earned the right to judge. The room remained completely still before another round of applause slowly rose, stronger than before. This time it wasn't celebrating an extraordinary purchase. It was honoring a truth that reached far beyond wealth or status. Richard Collins quietly watched from the edge of the ballroom, no longer wearing his security badge. His career had changed in a single evening, but perhaps something even more important had changed with it. Theodore Langford stood beside him in thoughtful silence, realizing that decades of success had never made him immune to prejudice. Emily closed the guest registry on her tablet with a quiet sense of hope, believing that asking one honest question had mattered more than remaining comfortably silent. As Naomi Brooks walked through the same entrance where she had first been stopped, every employee standing nearby respectfully stepped aside. Not because she had purchased the entire collection, not because she was a celebrated CEO, but because they finally understood the simplest lesson of the night. Dignity should never depend on recognition, and respect should never require proof. The grand doors closed behind her. The lights inside the ballroom continued to shine upon priceless works of art, and everyone left carrying the same unforgettable reminder. True greatness never announces itself. It simply stands with quiet confidence until the world finally learns to see it.